Stop resisting! The command echoed through the park, sharp and commanding, cutting through the quiet afternoon. Lauren Campbell froze, her book still in her hands, her pulse quickening as the words hung in the air. She hadn't moved an inch, hadn't made a sound, but somehow, it was her who was being accused of resisting. She looked up, confused, and saw two officers standing before her. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Jake, was gripping her arm with force, pulling her toward him. The other, a younger officer named Michael, stood back, his eyes narrowed, watching her every move like she was some kind of threat. Her heart raced, but she refused to let her panic show. "Excuse me?" Lauren asked, her voice calm but laced with disbelief. She set the book down on the bench beside her, her mind spinning. Was this really happening? "You heard me," Jake snapped, tightening his grip on her arm. "You're resisting arrest. Now stop it and come with us." Lauren's thoughts scrambled. Arrest? For what? She hadn't done anything wrong. She was simply sitting on a bench in a public park, reading a book on a sunny afternoon. The park was bustling with families, joggers, and children playing nearby. She hadn't even noticed the officers approaching until they were right in front of her. There was no warning, no attempt to engage her in conversation, just the force of his hand on her arm and the accusation of resistance. "I haven't done anything wrong," Lauren said, her voice rising slightly, but she quickly caught herself. There was no use in getting upset. It wouldn't help. "I'm just sitting here, reading my book." Michael stepped forward, his eyes scanning her face like she was hiding something. "We got a call," he said, his voice cold, "about suspicious activity in this area. You're not even from around here, are you?" Lauren blinked, taken aback. "What? I live in this city. I'm a resident of Los Angeles. I came here to enjoy the park." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The officers were treating her like a criminal for nothing more than sitting in a public space. Jake's face hardened, his tone dismissive. "Yeah, well, we still need to see your ID. You're not exactly making this easy on us." Lauren's throat tightened as she fought to keep her voice steady. "What's the reason for this? What exactly am I being accused of?" "It's routine," Michael said, his words carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. His gaze didn't waver, as if he was daring her to question him further. "Now, hand over your ID, or we'll have more problems." Lauren, still processing what was happening, slowly reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. She felt the sting of humiliation creeping in as she handed over her driver's license, her movements deliberate but calm. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. Not without a fight. Jake took the ID from her hand, inspecting it like he expected to find something wrong. "Lauren Campbell," he read aloud, almost mockingly. "And what are you doing here, Miss Campbell?" "I'm reading," she replied, her voice taut with barely contained frustration. "Is that a crime now?" Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her ID back, but his eyes were still cold, calculating. "We're just trying to do our jobs. Just answer a few more questions, and we'll let you go." Answer a few more questions? Lauren's voice barely concealed the rising anger. She could feel the eyes of the few people who had gathered nearby watching her, their murmurs barely audible, but present. This wasn't routine. This was an interrogation. "You're really going to keep this up?" Jake sneered, taking another step closer, his tone turning condescending. "You always carry books like that around? You're not meeting someone, are you? Got any weapons on you?" The words stung, and she could feel the judgment in them, the way they were sizing her up, as though she was guilty of something just by being there. They were treating her like a suspect, even though she had done nothing wrong. She refused to let herself be intimidated. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said, her voice firm. Her patience was wearing thin, and her resolve was hardening. This was absurd. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Jake's expression darkened, and he stepped forward again. This time, his hand shot out and grabbed her arm, the force of his grip painful. "You're resisting arrest," he snapped, his words full of venom as if he were performing for the small crowd that had begun to gather. "You don't want to make this worse." "What are you doing?" Lauren demanded, her breath quickening. This was happening far too quickly, and it was clear they had made up their minds about her. Her mind raced as the officer's grip tightened around her, pulling her toward the police cruiser. It was all happening so fast. She was being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. "Stop resisting!" Jake barked again, louder this time, as if to emphasize his point for the growing crowd. The voices around her were growing louder too, some curious, some uneasy. People had started pulling out their phones, filming the scene as the officers dragged her away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around her wrists. The sharp bite of the metal only added to the sting of the humiliation she was feeling. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the subtle click of phone cameras as people recorded the scene. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with a young woman holding her phone up in the air. For a moment, their gazes met, a silent understanding passing between them. The injustice unfolding in the park was now documented. The officers shoved her into the back of the cruiser, ignoring the questions and stares of the onlookers. The door slammed shut behind her with a hollow thud. As the car started moving, Lauren's mind raced. She couldn't believe this was happening. How had this simple, quiet moment turned into a nightmare? Inside the car, the air felt suffocating, the harsh fluorescent light above her flickering as the radio crackled with static. Lauren stared out the window, her reflection merging with the passing scenery. Her wrists ached from the cuffs, but the pain was nothing compared to the wave of anger and confusion that was threatening to consume her. She was being punished for nothing more than sitting in a park and reading a book. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to let this slide. She would fight back. This wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger than that. The police station was cold, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Lauren was led down a sterile gray hallway. The officer who had accompanied her to the holding area, a younger man named James, looked at her with a mix of indifference and amusement. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her as she walked in front of him, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The click of the cuffs echoed in the quiet hallway, each step a reminder of the humiliation she was enduring. She could hear the muffled sounds of other detainees in nearby cells, the occasional shout or laughter adding to the disorienting atmosphere. Lauren's mind was still reeling from the events in the park. How had everything escalated so quickly? One moment she was reading her book in peace. The next, she was being treated like a criminal. The injustice of it gnawed at her, but she wasn't about to let herself fall apart. She had been through worse in courtrooms, facing off against the most vicious of adversaries, but this felt different. This wasn't a case of defending a client. It was her own fight, her own battle for her dignity. James led her into a small, sterile room and motioned for her to sit on the hard metal bench. Lauren obeyed, her back straight and her face stoic. She refused to let the weight of the situation crush her, but the growing resentment and anger were hard to ignore. He stood in front of her, his eyes scanning her, not with concern, but with the kind of judgment she had grown accustomed to seeing from people like him. "Nice day for a book reading, huh?" James remarked sarcastically, his voice dripping with disdain. Lauren glanced up at him, but didn't answer. She could feel the anger bubbling up inside, but she wasn't going to let him see it. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that he was getting under her skin. "You know," he continued, his tone even more mocking, "it's not every day we get someone like you in here, a lawyer of all people. Thought you'd know better than to break the law like that." Lauren narrowed her eyes, finally meeting his gaze. "I didn't break any laws. You arrested me for reading in a park. If you call that breaking the law, then we have a problem." James chuckled darkly, clearly enjoying the control he had over her. "You really think you're above the law, huh? You all think you can just get away with anything because you have fancy degrees and high-paying jobs. Newsflash, sweetheart, it doesn't work like that. He took a step closer, his presence threatening. You're just like everyone else to us. You get out of line and we put you in your place. Lauren clenched her jaw, the fury inside her building. She wasn't going to let him get away with treating her like this. She had fought for justice her entire career, and now she was going to have to fight for herself. You're the one who's out of line, not me. You don't get to decide who deserves respect. I didn't do anything wrong. James stepped back, his expression darkening. Oh, you'll see about that, he said with a smirk, his words dripping with malice. We've got plenty of time to talk. I'm sure you're just as guilty as the rest of them. He turned and walked toward the door, calling out to someone Lauren couldn't see. A few moments later, the door opened, and another officer entered, a man named David. He was older, his face hard and etched with years of experience. He didn't look at Lauren at first, but when he did, his eyes were cold and calculating. Let's get this over with, David said, his voice like gravel. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He simply walked over to the desk, pulled out a stack of paperwork, and started filling out forms. Lauren watched him closely, wondering what was coming next. She could feel the tension in the room thickening. David glanced up from his paperwork. Lauren Campbell, is it? He said, his tone flat. You're being charged with resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. We have every right to hold you here until we sort this out. Lauren felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. Resisting arrest? Obstruction of justice? This is insane. You know as well as I do that none of that applies here. I was just sitting in a public park, reading. You arrested me for no reason. David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at James, who was standing by the door, watching the exchange with interest. The charge stands, David said after a beat, his voice low and unyielding. And don't think you're going to get away with this just because you're a lawyer. You're not special here. Lauren felt a jolt of anger surge through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let them break her. She had fought in courtrooms with far more dangerous people than these two, and she would not back down now. You're right about one thing, Lauren said, her voice steady and filled with quiet determination. I'm not special. But I do know my rights, and you violated them. David's lips curled into a small, mocking smile. Rights? He scoffed. You think we care about your rights? You're in our world now. You're going to follow the rules, or you're going to regret it. Lauren stood up suddenly, the chains of frustration and anger breaking loose for just a moment. I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like this, she snapped. You have no right to hold me. You have no right to do any of this. David's eyes narrowed, and he slowly walked toward her, his presence imposing. Sit back down, he commanded, his voice hard as steel. I don't have time for this. For a moment, Lauren's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the situation almost too much to bear. But she didn't back down. She didn't flinch. She stood tall, defiant in the face of their cruelty. David sighed, clearly growing frustrated with her resistance. Fine. Have it your way, he muttered, as he turned toward the door. You'll get your chance to speak in court. If you're lucky, maybe someone will actually listen to you. But I wouldn't count on it. James chuckled darkly from his corner of the room. Yeah, you're not getting out of this that easy, sweetheart. Lauren's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had fought for justice for years, and she would keep fighting for it now, even if it meant taking on the entire system, even if it meant going through hell to get there. After all, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following Lauren's arrest were a blur. She was released on bail after a long, uncomfortable night spent in a cramped holding cell, and as she walked out of the station, the cool night air hit her like a slap in the face. The sense of relief was fleeting. Her body was exhausted, her mind a whirlwind of questions and anger. The ride home felt surreal. Everything that had happened seemed impossible. She was a respected attorney, and yet She had been treated like a criminal. For what? Sitting in a park and reading a book? The next morning, Lauren sat in her apartment, surrounded by legal pads and open law books. The early sunlight filtered through the windows, but it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like the start of a long, difficult battle. She had been fighting for justice her entire career, but this time, the fight was for herself. She wasn't going to let the officers, Jake and Michael, get away with what they had done. She would use every tool at her disposal to make them pay for their actions. But first, she had to face her colleagues. Lauren was used to pressure, to dealing with powerful people and dangerous situations, but the thought of talking to her law firm about the case made her stomach turn. She knew they were going to be hesitant. The firm prided itself on maintaining a pristine reputation, and a public fight against the police was something they likely wouldn't want to be associated with. She could already hear their arguments in her mind. "It's not worth the publicity, Lauren. We can't afford to take a stand like this. It'll cost us clients." Her phone buzzed, and Lauren snapped out of her thoughts. It was a text from Marissa, her closest friend and fellow lawyer at the firm. "I've been thinking about what happened. You need to go public with this. You've got the chance to change things." Marissa had been one of the first people to rush to her side when she was released from the station. She knew Lauren wouldn't back down from a fight, but she also knew that this wasn't just a fight for one person. It was a fight for the truth, for justice. Lauren had always been the one to take on the tough cases, to stand up for the voiceless, but this time, the stakes were personal. Lauren stared at her phone, tapping her fingers on the desk. Marissa was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. It was about the systemic abuse of power and the need for accountability. But the thought of publicly taking on the police, of airing her personal humiliation in front of the world, felt like stepping into the unknown. With a sigh, she typed a quick response. "You're right. Let's do this." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Lauren reached out to a trusted colleague who had connections in the media, and soon enough, the video of her arrest went viral. It was everywhere, on social media, the news, and even in the streets of Los Angeles. The footage, which showed Lauren being dragged by two officers for no reason at all, sparked outrage. People from all walks of life reached out to her, offering their support, sharing their own stories of injustice. The video was powerful, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about her anymore. By the end of the week, Lauren had filed a civil rights lawsuit against the police officers involved. She was determined to hold them accountable for their actions. The law firm was not thrilled with her decision, but they had no choice but to stand behind her. The public pressure was too great, and the firm couldn't afford to lose their reputation in the legal community. But Lauren knew that wasn't why she was doing this. She wasn't in it for the recognition, the media coverage, or even for her own sense of vindication. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. She spent long nights researching the law, poring over case studies, and putting together a strategy for the upcoming trial. She knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Fighting against the police was never a simple task, but she had the tools and the knowledge to win. As the days passed, Lauren's resolve grew stronger. The support from the public kept coming in, and she could feel the weight of their expectations. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for anyone who had ever been wronged, silenced, or dismissed by those in power. This case wasn't just about a personal vendetta, it was about proving that the system could be held accountable. One evening, as she was reviewing her notes for the 100th time, Marissa stopped by with takeout. Lauren barely looked up as Marissa set the food on the table. "You've been at this for hours," Marissa said, her voice soft with concern. "You need to take a break." Lauren didn't respond at first. She was too focused on the papers in front of her. Finally, she looked up, meeting her friend's gaze. "I can't stop now," Lauren said, her voice low and determined. "I have to finish this. I have to make them pay." Marissa sat across from her, studying her face. "I know, but you're not alone in this. You've got all of us. Lauren's eyes softened slightly. She had always been the one people turned to for support, the one who never needed help. But this time, it was different. This time, she needed her friends more than ever. "I know," she said quietly, "but this is mine to fight. I can't let it go. If I do, then what was the point of everything I've done?" The fight for justice was about to begin in earnest. Lauren had already done the hard part. She had made the decision to take this to court. The rest would be a battle of wits, of strategy, of resilience. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced down far more dangerous opponents in her career. This she could handle. The next morning, as Lauren prepared to leave for the office, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her attorney. "They've assigned the officers to your case. They're going to try to dismiss it, but we can beat them. You're going to need to be prepared." Lauren's stomach sank as she read the message. The officers, Jake and Michael, were now going to be her adversaries in court. She had known it was coming, but it still hit her hard. She had been arrested by these men, humiliated in front of a crowd, and now she was going to have to face them again, this time as a lawyer. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, but Lauren wasn't about to let them win. She knew the system wasn't perfect. She knew that sometimes, even when you're in the right, the fight is long, and the odds are stacked against you. But she also knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now, not ever. And when the moment came for her to sit in the judge's chair and face Jake and Michael once more, she would make sure they understood one thing. Justice was coming, and it wasn't going to be kind to those who thought they were above it. The courtroom was packed, a quiet hum of anticipation in the air as people filed in. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a deep sense of support for Lauren Campbell. But one thing was certain. Today's trial wasn't going to be ordinary. It was going to be a battle for justice, and it was a battle Lauren was determined to win. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the proceedings, the tension in the room grew palpable. Lauren sat at the front, her back straight and her gaze focused. She wore a sharp, dark suit, nothing extravagant, but professional and composed. It was a sharp contrast to the chaos swirling inside her mind. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but nothing could quite prepare her for the weight of it. The officers who had wrongfully arrested her, Jake and Michael, would be sitting just a few feet away, their smug expressions barely hidden behind their lawyers' polished professionalism. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell silent. Everyone stood, including Lauren. The judge entered the room, his robes flowing behind him. He was a middle-aged man with a reputation for being fair, but firm. He looked down at Lauren briefly before turning his attention to the officers. She noticed how their bodies stiffened in response to his presence. The trial began with the usual formalities. The attorneys introduced themselves and the charges. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the case, the accusations of false arrest, the abuse of power, the humiliation Lauren had endured. She could feel the prosecutor's words reinforcing everything she had experienced, the helplessness, the anger, the unfairness of it all. But she wasn't about to let herself be consumed by the past. She was here for one thing, to make sure that what had happened to her didn't just vanish into the void, swept under the rug like it never mattered. She would make sure of that. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, turning to face the judge, "we are here today because two police officers who swore an oath to protect and serve the public wrongfully arrested an innocent woman. She was simply sitting in a public park, reading a book. And yet, these officers accosted her, interrogated her without cause, and treated her like a criminal." Lauren's heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed composed. Her gaze flicked to Jake and Michael, who were seated at the defendant's table, their faces unreadable. She could see the tension in their bodies, the nervous glances they exchanged. Their confidence was cracking. The prosecutor continued. "The evidence is clear. The video footage, which went viral, shows Miss Campbell being dragged away from the park in cuffs, despite her calm demeanor and cooperation. These officers had no reason to arrest her, and their actions were nothing short of an abuse of power. Lauren shifted in her seat, her jaw clenched. She had been the one in those handcuffs, the one humiliated in front of a crowd, the one whose rights had been trampled. And now she was sitting in this courtroom, fighting back. The thought should have brought her some comfort, but it didn't. Not yet. Not until the men who had caused her this pain were held accountable. Jake and Michael's lawyer, a tall, well-groomed man named Peter, stood up to address the court. His eyes scanned the room briefly, making sure he had everyone's attention before he spoke. His voice was smooth, calculated, like the polished appearance he wore. But there was something about it that grated on Lauren's nerves. His tone dripped with arrogance, as if he was already certain of victory. It made her stomach churn. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Peter began, his words measured, "what we have here is a misunderstanding, a moment of miscommunication between officers who were doing their jobs and a woman who chose to escalate the situation. Let's not forget that police officers are trained to respond to perceived threats. Miss Campbell, despite her claims, was not a victim here. She was a participant in her own arrest." Lauren's eyes narrowed. He was trying to turn the story on her, trying to make her the villain. She had expected it, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. She was no criminal. She was no troublemaker. She was a lawyer, a defender of justice. And yet, here she was, being painted as someone who had somehow caused all this chaos. "The officers did not arrest Miss Campbell on a whim," Peter continued, his voice growing more confident with each word. "They responded to a call about suspicious activity, and when they approached her, she became combative. She refused to cooperate. She resisted their instructions. And in the end, they had no choice but to take her into custody." Lauren gritted her teeth. She wanted to shout, to scream that this wasn't true, that she had done nothing wrong. But she stayed silent, letting the prosecutor take over the cross-examination. The prosecutor stood up again, his tone sharp, cutting through Peter's defense. "Let me ask you, Officer Jake," he said, addressing the officer sitting at the defendant's table. "What exactly was the suspicious activity that you and Officer Michael were responding to that day? Was it the fact that Miss Campbell was reading a book in the park? Was it the fact that she was sitting alone, enjoying a quiet afternoon?" Jake shifted in his seat, his face turning red. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out right away. It was clear that he wasn't prepared for this. His arrogance had started to falter under the weight of the evidence. I wasn't sure at the time," he muttered, his voice sounding weaker than before. "We just got a call about something strange happening in the park." "And what exactly was strange about Miss Campbell sitting on a park bench reading a book?" the prosecutor pressed. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the room. She was alone. It was odd, okay? We thought something was off." The prosecutor leaned in slightly, his voice lowering in intensity. "So, because a woman is sitting alone in a park, you decided she was suspicious? That's your justification for this entire ordeal?" Jake flushed, his eyes avoiding the prosecutor's gaze. "I was just following protocol," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Peter, the defense attorney, immediately stood to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he called out, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the trial was going. "This is irrelevant. The officers acted within the boundaries of the law." The judge nodded, giving the defense attorney a brief look, before turning his attention back to the prosecutor. "Sustained. Move on, please," he instructed. But the damage had been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and even Jake, the officer responsible for Lauren's arrest, seemed unsure of his own defense. Lauren felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. She knew this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over yet. There was still more to come, more lies to expose, more truths to uncover. The trial would be long, but she was prepared for it. She had come too far to let them win now. As the proceedings continued, Lauren could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by those in power. every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. She wasn't going to let them win. Not today. Not ever. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of the trial had spread like wildfire, and people from all walks of life were there to witness the unfolding drama. Reporters filled the back row, their cameras trained on the officers sitting at the defendant's table, their eyes occasionally glancing toward Lauren. She could feel their gaze, but it didn't faze her. She had been the one who had suffered the humiliation, not them. She was the one whose dignity had been stripped away, not the officers. Today, however, she would take back what was rightfully hers. Today, she would make sure justice prevailed. The judge entered the room, his gavel striking sharply as he called the court to order. The tension was palpable, everyone waiting for the next stage of the trial. Lauren sat at the front, her posture perfect, her eyes locked forward. The moment she had been preparing for was finally here. It was time for the verdict to be delivered. The prosecutor stood up, his voice clear and authoritative as he addressed the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence has been presented, the facts have been laid bare. What we have here is a blatant case of abuse of power. Two officers, sworn to protect and serve, instead used their authority to humiliate and arrest an innocent woman. A woman who was doing nothing more than sitting in a public park, reading a book. Lauren felt her heart race as the prosecutor's words sank in. She had fought so hard for this moment. She had worked tirelessly to bring this case to light, to make sure these men faced the consequences of their actions. And now, it was up to the jury to decide if they would stand with her or let the officers walk free. The officers involved in this case, the prosecutor continued, acted out of prejudice and incompetence. They had no reason to approach Miss Campbell, no reason to arrest her, and no reason to treat her with such disrespect. They ignored her civil rights. They ignored her peaceful demeanor, and they instead chose to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as the prosecutor's words hit their mark. She could see Jake and Michael shifting in their seats. They were no longer sitting so confidently. Their arrogance, once so palpable, had started to crack. The cracks were small, but they were there, and Lauren was determined to exploit them. The defense attorney, Peter, stood up to make his final argument. He wasn't as smooth as he had been in the earlier stages of the trial. There was a certain nervousness to him now, a sense that he wasn't quite sure how to spin things anymore. He adjusted his tie and took a deep breath before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Peter began, his voice still carrying that same confident, rehearsed tone, but it lacked the power it had held at the start. "We acknowledge that the situation that day was unfortunate. But let's not forget that police officers are human. They act on instinct, on training, and sometimes their judgment is clouded. They thought they were doing their job, responding to a call, and they did what they thought was necessary." Lauren's fists clenched in frustration as Peter spoke. She could feel the anger boiling up inside her. This wasn't about instinct. This wasn't about making a mistake. This was about power. This was about two men using their position to control her, to strip away her dignity for no reason at all. And Peter, this smug, condescending lawyer, was trying to excuse it all as if it were just a misunderstanding. "They weren't perfect," Peter continued, his voice rising slightly. "But they didn't break the law. They didn't act out of malice. And they certainly didn't deserve to have their careers ruined over something like this." Lauren could feel her blood boiling. He was trying to humanize the officers, trying to make them seem like they were the victims here. She could see Jake, slouched in his seat, his face drawn tight with tension. His arrogance had all but evaporated, replaced by something else, something that looked a lot like regret. But it wasn't enough, not by a long shot. Peter's voice grew quieter, more insistent. All they were trying to do was uphold the law. They have families, they have careers, they have lives outside of this. Let's not destroy them over something that was, at the end of the day, a misunderstanding. The prosecutor stood up once more, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, Let's not get distracted by the defense's attempt to humanize these men, the prosecutor said. What they did wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of overreach. They had no reason to approach Miss Campbell. They had no reason to arrest her. They had no reason to treat her with disrespect. The truth is, they abused their power, and they need to be held accountable. The prosecutor's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Lauren could feel the heat of his words in her chest. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. The jury had heard the facts, they had seen the video, and now it was time for them to decide. As the judge adjourned the session for deliberation, Lauren's thoughts raced. She knew how easy it would be for the jury to let the officers off the hook. She knew how powerful the police could be in these situations, how much influence they could wield, especially when it came to a case like this. But she had to believe that they wouldn't let the officers get away with it. They couldn't. This was bigger than just her. This was about setting a precedent for anyone who had ever been mistreated, for anyone who had been wronged by those who were supposed to protect them. Hours later, the jury returned. The room fell silent as the foreman stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. His eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, Lauren could feel her heart pounding in her ears. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of excessive force, false arrest, and violation of civil rights, the foreman said, his voice clear and firm. A wave of relief washed over Lauren, but it was tempered by the gravity of the moment. She had won, yes, but it was more than that. This wasn't just about a legal victory. This was about something much bigger. It was about justice. It was about making sure that the officers who had wronged her would face the consequences of their actions. Jake and Michael sat in stunned silence, their faces pale. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. They weren't the ones holding all the power. It was Lauren who had the power now. It was Lauren who had fought back and won. As the courtroom began to empty, Lauren stood, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She had done it. She had taken on the system, and she had won. The weight of everything she had gone through, every moment of humiliation, every second of doubt, felt lighter now. She had stood up for herself, for everyone who had ever been wronged. And in that moment, she knew that she had made a difference. But this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. There was still so much work to do, and Lauren Campbell wasn't about to stop now. As the gavel came down, marking the end of the trial, Lauren sat in the courtroom, her heart still racing from the victory she had just secured. The weight of what had happened, the injustice she'd faced, the battle she'd fought, and the justice she'd finally seen, was starting to settle in. She had been humiliated, silenced, and treated unfairly, but in the end, she had risen above it all. It wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult or intimidating the fight might seem. In a world where so many injustices go unchallenged, Lauren's story serves as a powerful reminder that even when the system fails us, we have the power to fight back. It's a story of resilience, determination, and above all, the pursuit of justice. But Lauren's victory isn't the end of the battle. It's just one step forward. There are still so many people out there who face similar challenges, and it's up to all of us to stand up for what's right and demand accountability. If Lauren's story resonated with you, if it sparked something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How can we continue to fight for justice, both in our own lives and in the world around us? And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories that challenge the system and fight for what's fair. Together, we can make a difference. Let's keep pushing for a better, more just world. Начало формы, конец формы.